There are many watercolor painting techniques, and one of which is the flat wash. Flat wash can be done using wet on wet or wet on dry techniques. So let's take a look at the wet on wet. So now the paper is dry. So first step is we need to prime the paper with water. And that serves as the wet surface so that later on we can apply wet paint on the wet surface, and that's why the name is called wet on wet technique. So wet on wet technique is commonly used for many artists, especially during the underpaint procedure. Artists often want to try to cover a large area of the surface and trying to achieve a very even application of the watercolor. So now the surface is wet enough, and while it's wet, I'm going to mix some ultramarine blue color or any color that your choice, and make sure that you mix enough of a quantity. I'm talking about the volume of the watercolor paint, because watercolor you only have a few seconds to react. So if you don't preload enough, you're going to waste a lot of time in between loading it, mixing it, and while the surface is trying to dry and work against you. So now I'm going to apply randomly with the watercolor paint, and you can see the layer that we pre-wash is just really helps the watercolor paint to move and flow around. So even with the simple strokes that I just did, you can see a nice, even, thin layer of the water paint can be achieved. And that is done through wet on wet technique. So what could go wrong with this type of technique? Usually students or beginners had trouble doing this for many reasons. Number one is they don't prime the surface wet enough, or they prime the surface too wet. So let's talk about if it's not wet enough. If it's not wet enough, you're going to apply the paint on top of it, and what you're going to have, the outcome is a streak of uneven painted surface. That's not what you want. You really want to have a nice, even, flat surface. Secondly, if it's too wet, there's a problem, because when you do the flat wash, you want to protect the area that you don't want the paint to flow through. So normally, you protect that area by restricting the color flow at the beginning. So by too much water, sometimes the paint can overflow even with the protected area, then lands into area that you don't want it to land to. And also, to couple with the wet on wet and it being too wet prime, or after application of watercolor, and many students or beginners, they don't have the angle of their paper, of their board. So without the angle, you basically don't use the gravity to help pull the color downward. By sitting the board flat, you basically let the water sit and being idle and being flooded in the center of the paper. It's not going to move anywhere, right? Watercolor is about making the water flow, the paint to flow, right? But it makes no sense the water or part of water or part of paint sitting there idle and does nothing but cause a flood and eventually cause a defect on your drawing. So that being said, flat wash, if you do it primer right, if you preload the paint enough in volume, and also keep the board in the angle, and preferably is 30 degrees angle, and that will ensure you have a good flat wash like I just did. So now we talk about second technique, right? To achieve the same thing, flat wash. So how do we do that? It's going to be a wet on dry. Now, wet on dry is a matter of controlling your water bead. Now remember, water bead. If you don't have water bead, 水珠, if you don't have the water bead, there's no guarantee that you're going to achieve the nice even surface, right? So more importantly, so to achieve the water beads, you must preload your template with lots of color and lots of water so that it is enough volume so you don't have to mix in between of the application. So now the paper is dry and I already loaded a whole bunch of paint volume on my palette. Now, when I apply paint, wet paint on the dry paper, and that's why it's called wet on dry, I want to make sure that I achieve the water beads. You see, I have enough water. At the beginning stroke, I see water beads, but then I lose the water bead eventually. So I make sure I add a little bit of paint so that I get water bead along the line. And that will set stage and ready for my second stroke. And the subsequent stroke, I don't have to repeat this first stroke. I just go next to it and hit the water bead as such. And I want to make sure the second stroke also end with water beads. So, and I can't stress enough that water beads, if it's not present there, you cannot achieve an even wash. So third stroke, same thing. Right? Touch the previous stroke and make sure I leave the water beads along the third stroke. Now I will do the same for a subsequent stroke and you will see what I mean. So same thing, water beads, right? So make sure you load your watercolor, enough volume to allow you to cover the area with water beads, right? And if we don't get the water bead, we miss the point. The point of the wet on dry flat wash is the key is using the water bead as an indicator, right? As an indicator that the paint will flow downward with the gravity pull by the angle that you set to about 30 degrees, right? So 90% of all the beginner or my students had trouble with are on this technique is don't load paint enough beforehand, and they don't see the water beads as critical. So I can't stress enough to achieve an even flat wash we must leave water beads on each time we apply new stroke. And not to ensure that the watercolor actually flow, right, as a sheet. You can see now the wash is very flat. You don't see any streaks of brush strokes, and it's very even and very thin and very transparent. So again, what could go wrong with this technique? What could go wrong is don't pay attention to the water beads. So 水珠 is very important. 没有水珠呢，我们不可以做到这么通透完整的水彩 underwash. So key to capture the flat wash using the wet on wet technique is you need to pre-prime the water with water, and you have to preload the color beforehand, and you need to go randomly on the surface and let the pre-primed water allow the watercolor to penetrate and spread naturally by itself, and that will achieve very even surface, transparent and thin layer. And while the wet on wet give you a lot more control, because you kind of control where the watercolor should land to, rather than let the wet on wet technique that it spread by itself. So the key to the wet on dry technique is to make sure that for every stroke you must leave a water bead. If you don't see the water bead, there's no success. I can guarantee that there's not going to be any success in achieving the even surface. Okay?